Nice to see so many faces. My name's Loren Anderson, introduced a little earlier. Was anyone here licensed before 1969? There. So I was wondering if I was the old timer, but as far as experience goes, I actually was inactive for between 35 and 40 years. So I may have been licensed a long time ago, but there's a lot more experience in the room than I have. A little background. I will admit that when I floated the idea of this presentation, some eyes rolled. But I will say that Bob gave me the most important piece of advice on this. He said, don't be boring. Because honestly, there is quite a bit of information about this on the web. YouTube videos, some documents that the ARL has put out. They're boring. It is not an exciting subject, but why should you care? It's well, I shouldn't say it's the law, but it is a regulation and it is a requirement. FCC Report and Order 19-126 is brand new. It came out, I believe, on May 3rd of this year. So it's about 6 weeks old. And it is rules regarding the RF exposure that emanates from equipment that we are operating. And past exposure standards haven't changed. This stuff has been in effect for a very, very long time. What has changed is that it is no longer easy to get an automatic exemption from doing what we're going to talk about tonight. There were some very broad exemptions. If you're operating less than 500 watts on 20 meters, you don't have to apply. Something to that effect. There are some bulletins that talk about how to do that. What I'm going to attempt to do tonight is share information to make this as easy as possible. And as I started working on this myself, realizing that I had never ever done this before because I never felt compelled to and nobody ever said that I had to, I thought, you know, there's some stuff in here that, as easy as it ought to be, might just be a little confusing, and I'm really going to try and emphasize that rather than really get down into the nitty-gritty. We'll cover a bunch of stuff, related to that, but try to keep this as interesting as possible. Some of this information, a good bit of this information, was from an ARL presentation on YouTube. It's about an hour and 20 minutes long with all of the questions that it generated. Is it possible that the FCC could come knocking on your door? Yes, it can. And I'm going to share a firsthand experience about that. But also realizing, and we'll talk about this several times, is that this is a safety measure. RF energy can cause physical and bodily harm to individuals that are overexposed. So the first-hand story is I was in the electrical engineering building at North Dakota State University one evening studying. I had a key to the ham radio shack. And I could lock that door and it was quiet, a perfect study environment. Knock on the door. Who in the world is knocking on the door? There were 2 suits that came to visit. One of them was the FAA. One of them, I believe, was the FCC. They might have been both FAA. But they opened the door, I let them in, said, are you a member of they knew that it was the Ham Radio Club. Have you been operating? No, I've been studying. They went in and put their hands on the equipment to verify that it was cold. Because what I learned later is that somebody in a direct line that went right over the university had some transmitting equipment key down on the ground station frequency of the local airport. They weren't kidding around. It was serious. Now, could that happen? Yeah, well, I don't think we're operating on airport frequencies, but but interference can be taken very, very seriously. Or maybe you've just got that neighbor that sees the antennas in your backyard and has some interference on his TV or stereo equipment and complains. So how do we address that? I'm not going to read this. RF exposure is a at the frequencies we're talking about, is a non-ionizing radiation, meaning it doesn't knock electrons out of cells or atoms, but it does cause heating. And that's really what the damaging can be. Tissue will heat up in the presence of RF signals. And too much of that is not a good thing. So it's important. We're categorized as radio amateurs as operating in a controlled environment where we are able to have higher thresholds of RF energy, but the damage is really due to the energy. So it's not just watts, but it's the period of time. Energy is power times time as a formula. The longer you're exposed, the more heating that could occur, the more damage. Here's where it gets interesting. The general population, that means that somebody who can walk past your yard or even through your yard and you're operating, they can be exposed and they can be at a much closer distance than you would normally expect people to be. That's an uncontrolled environment. The thresholds for the RF energy is much lower. We'll go into what it's maximum permissible exposure. It's for a shorter period of time because generally people are going to be transiting, and so they wouldn't be exposed as long, but the threshold has to be much lower. Back to the report. FCC 19-126, 159 pages long. I don't recommend reading it. Might want to glance through it, look at a few pictures and a few tables in there, but I don't recommend it. As I mentioned, exemptions are not automatic. You must perform calculation that you are entitled to an exemption from performing that calculation to determine exposure level. The wording in this stuff is confusing. If there are questions at the end and we're still confused, we'll try to address them, but there is going to be some confusing language in there. So, if you've done an RF exposure test previously and you have not changed the equipment or have not changed your antennas, you have a 2-year grace period from doing this again, or from doing it to catch up. If you're a new ham, you have new equipment, new station, you're obligated to do that. Well, hams have to take a test. We're obligated to know something before we're given permission to operate. The FCC has decided that, well, if we're going to grant you that privilege, we're going to tell you have to perform this. As I said, if you make any changes or it's a new installation, new transmitter, new antenna, you're obligated. Mentioned this before. Why should you take it seriously? Safety and the fact that these are the rules that we operate under. What do we need to do? We perform an analysis and verify the compliance that we're within the limits set by the FCC, and I'll show you this here, what that means shortly. You would document the analysis and file it where you might be able to find it again. It's actually, here's where it's a little weird. It's optional. You don't need to keep your calculations on file. If the FCC calls on you, you will be obligated to prove that you've been operating within the limits. So if you perform the calculations, put it in a file cabinet and save it for that time. And, you know, and another point, and this could apply to your next door neighbor or a neighbor, or potentially even if you're petitioning a local HOA to do something, is having this level of calculation. Well, what's the reason for not doing it? Now, it's a nuisance. Well, you're in the trees up here. A lot of you live in the woods. Well, it's not an eyesore. People wouldn't even necessarily notice it. You could use this information, and I actually have a friend in an HOA association in California that used this kind of information to get permission to put up some antennas in his neighborhood, and they were expressly forbidden according to the rules. Here's a chart: maximum permissible exposure, the MPE, and it is a chart here that is varying by frequency that you see, and in the HF range, 300 kilohertz up to 30 megahertz, we have changing numbers. Here we have milliwatts per square centimeter. That is power within an area, and I'll show you a few pictures of what that actually means. The most stringent figures are from 30 to 300 megahertz. Our 6 meter and 2 meter bands fall in that category, and they have the lowest limits. So what are the exemptions, and why should there be an exemption? If you operate a few milliwatts, you're not going to cause any damage. If nobody is able to get close enough to the radiating source, you can be exempted. But there's a good bit of calculation to go through just to determine whether or not you have an exemption. And I'm going to make a little bit later is, yeah, you can do the math to determine you have an exemption. It's really easy to go figure out what the real limits are, and you might as well take that next extra step. So, new exemptions based on three things. The frequency, you saw the chart where it varied by frequency. So, in some bands you may be okay, in other bands you may not be okay. You have to check all of them. The maximum ERP, effective radiated power. And we'll go into this in a little bit, but that is not the power output of your transmitter or the power level that you have set at your transmitter. Distance between a person and any part of the antenna. Exemptions do not apply to distances less than lambda, the wavelength, divided by 2 pi, which is called the reactive near field. So again, there's exemptions, but you might as well do the calculations. So, here's the information that you find online. It doesn't tell you anything. You got to do calculations. The threshold ERP in the HF band, 1.34 megahertz to 30 megahertz, 3,450 times r squared, the radius in meters squared. That is the closest distance that people would be exposed to the antenna, divided by the frequency squared. Don't write this down. Don't take notes on this. But this is the kind of information that if you were just going into the documentation would have to figure out. Well, you may think you've got an exemption, but then you find out that exemptions cannot be taken if the distance between the antenna and a human is less than these distances. So, HF operators, 20 meters. If anybody can essentially get within 10.3 feet of that, you can't take an exemption. You got to do the calculation. Take 2 meters, the distance is 1 foot. Well, how far are you holding the microphone from your HT to talk? You can't take an exemption. This is we'll get to this. So how do I prefer?
For the general public, like they would be in the commercial broadcast. In other words, the general public cannot get within that distance, but you as the operator or you as the resident live within that distance?
Yes, but unless you have fences, you're in an uncontrolled environment. So it would be the general public.
These things are basically the same as commercial broadcast exposure.
Yes, they are. Yes, I may have had it on the slide, but I didn't mention it. We're categorized like the professionals. We're not exempt because we're radio amateurs. We're considered equivalent to the professionals in this industry in the way that we have to control the environment. Good news. There are online tools that make it quite easy if you understand a few basic items. And this is kind of where I wanted to take this, is that this is some information that I hope you'll find helpful in using the online tools that actually make the calculation easy. So I'm not going to go into excruciating detail. Some of this information may be useful for those of you thinking of upgrading, because there's some terms and some information in here that is relevant to some of the questions that you find on some of the tests. We saw this before. Exposure limits vary dependent on frequency. You need to do the calculation at every frequency, or I should say every band you operate in. If you're marginal in an area, there's some other things that we can do. But what we're talking about, peak envelope power to the antenna times the duty factor times the operating time as a percentage is equal to the average power. Not the EIP yet, but this is the average power that's going to the antenna. Then the average power times the antenna gain is now the effective radiated power, and that's the important number that we're going to get to. What's the average power? Your radio manufacturer specifies this. So our club portable station, the IC 7300, 100 watts PEP max. The Kenwood dual band VHF UHF, 50 watts PEP max. That may not be the numbers though that you're operating at. What's PEP? Peak envelope power. If we have a modulated signal, not essentially think of this as like a single sideband signal where you have amplitude modulation based on the voice frequency where the carrier frequency would be. So imagine this is 14.25 megahertz and now audio frequency at 1 kilohertz in the audio range. The peak envelope power is the maximum power at any one time, but you're not transmitting that much power all the time. This is where duty factor is going to come in. If you're operating CW and you're sending dots and dashes, you are putting out 100% of the power, but not all the time. So your average power is not the peak envelope power in this particular case. Frequency modulation is the same way. We're varying the frequency. We put out the same amount of power, and as long as we're talking, that's the peak envelope power. That second factor, though, that applies is now the duty factor. How often are we transmitting? What is the average? How are we calculating that average power? So this chart came from a publication from 1998 from the ARRL, RF exemptions in U, exposure in U, sorry. Conversational single sideband, duty cycle or duty factor, 20%. Maybe. That could be a little bit different. I'll show you how that might vary. Well, here's conversational single sideband, 40%. If we compress the audio, because we have compression capability in HF transmitters, it's not 20%, it's probably closer to 40%. Single sideband, AFSK, audio frequency shift keying, or slow scan TV, 100%. Voice AM, some varying numbers, voice FM, 100%, digital, 100%. Transmitting all the time and tones are varying. for that digital signal. Radio teletype, 2 tones. You hear that warble on the bands. You're transmitting at 100%. And a few others here. Why would compressed single sideband have a higher duty cycle? This is the bad signal. This blue line represents a threshold. Above that, HF rigs have what's called an ALC circuit, automatic limiting control. What it does is says, I don't want to drive that much into my radio finals. I'm going to clip that off. Bad thing on a single sideband call or an AM call, because it will seriously distort the audio at the other end. So you would turn this down, and now these peaks and valleys would all be below the line, but the power is minimized. If you compress it, what you do is you increase the amount of power without driving it to high levels, so that this level will have a greater power density than this would be if you just cut the mic gain down to where it all fell under that line. So that's why it varies. These are some of the points that, just to avoid some of the confusion, but knowing this could mean the difference between a calculation that is under the threshold or over the threshold. I mentioned these before: signals with 100% duty factor, RIDI, PSK 31, FD8, FM signal. So now, operating time. That's easy. I tend to talk less than I listen. But worst case, just say 50%. I talk about as much as I listen in a QSO. And when we're averaging the amount of exposure, and we consider it over a 6-minute period of time or a 20 minutes of time, which isn't actually part of the calculation, that's how we get the average power. So now we know what the PEP is, we know what we're operating, we know what the operating time would be of just assuming 50% average power. That's the PEP input to the antenna. It's not the ERP yet. And remember, you need to do this to figure out if you qualify for the exemption. So, what happens now in calculating the ERP? I've got a 75-foot run of RG213 that goes to my HF antenna. You can find tables online, and I put a bunch of links in this presentation, so you can use it as a point of reference when it gets posted to the website. But just to illustrate, this says at 30 megahertz, RG213 has a loss in 100 feet of 1.2 dB. Well, my average power just got cut by 1.2 dB just from a 100-foot run. I have a 75-foot run, that's 75% of that, or 0.9 dB at 30 megahertz. These tables aren't very good because it doesn't show me what it is at 14 or at 20 14 megahertz. So these online calculators are much better for that. Lower frequency, I'm going to have less loss. I'm going to have higher power going to the antenna. So now, average power at the antenna is, with a dB loss calculator, 100 watts minus 0.807 dB. That is the loss in the coax, because that's what it actually was at 20 meters. There's some math here. 100 divided by 10 to the 0.0807. Wait a minute, it was 0.807. Power dB is a 10 log of the power ratio. So it's 0.087, which equals 100 divided by 1.204, or 83.1 watts. So I've lost 17 watts in my transmission line in a reasonable installation. Times 100% duty factor, times 50% operating time, 41 watts average power to the antenna. It's not ERP yet. Finally, we get there. What is my antenna gain expressed in dBi? I'll tell you why Jim's moaning. Here's what an isotropic antenna looks like. It's a dot in the center and it radiates equally in every direction. And this is a reference antenna. It doesn't exist. It's not possible. It's all theoretical, but it's a convenient reference point. So, single point in a square centimeter, whatever distance, that's what the power would be at any given point around that. More practically, there's a dipole antenna. And this is a pattern that you would see. They're most efficient. They work best off the broadsides of your dipole. And why does this have 2.2 dBi of gain in an ideal situation? Well, instead of radiating off the ends, the power is more concentrated in a direction. So the amount of effective power goes up as a result of that. Just to confuse things, you will see antennas spec'd in gain as dBi or dBd, decibel relative to the dipole. So this antenna is 2.2 dBi. That's actually about 2.15 rounding, or 0 dBd. Okay, you need to know this and pay attention because 2 dB is going to be a little less than twice the power. 3 dB would be a doubling of the effective radiated power. Directional antenna, I just grabbed one from a 2-element Cubex quad. And they express down here in the small print the gain of these antennas in dBd. So if the formula calls for dBi, you add 2.2 to any dBd number that you would encounter. And if you find a table like this, here, credit was from a website called Hamwaves, cut off on the bottom here. But here, half wavelength dipole, the gain in dBi is 2.15, dBd 0. So just important to keep an eye on that. Now we can get to the ERP calculation. So we figured out 41.5 watts, and I have a vertical antenna, which is about a 1 dBi gain. There's online calculators that do it, and that would come up to 52.3 watts. Took a while to get there, but pretty confident with that. You do it once, now it's pretty easy to go through and do it at each of the bands that you're currently operating on. If you want to do it yourself, for some reason I had to go figure out and make sure that I was putting good numbers in, and I did calculate it out, and you have to remember your high school advanced calculus to remember how to use the log rules, which I had to go pull out some really crusty old books to figure out. But my ERP calculated at 52.48, and this is rounding errors. And again, links to help do that conversion. Now what? So there were some equations back at the beginning in here that I showed that you could determine if you qualified for the exemption, but you're almost there, so you might as well keep going. So now you look at, is your uncontrolled area closer than the exception minimum distance at the operating frequency? Does your ERP exceed the exemption limit? If yes to either, you have to calculate the RF exposure. You're already there, the rest is easy, and we can thank Stu at hamradioschool.com. You actually got a good plug in that ARRL YouTube video. And they used your spreadsheet as a reference. But On Stu's website, this Excel spreadsheet can be downloaded, put local on your computer, and instead of going through all that calculation, you enter, what is your transmitter PEP output? There's that 100 watts. We don't have to worry about the other stuff. Feed line length. So I have 75 feet. Stu does make you go in and find out what the loss of your transmission line is at 100 feet, because that's the way that most of them are spec'd. 1.076, well, that was that 0.8 something that I had earlier.
Feed line loss per 100 feet, that comes out of the specs of your cable.
Right.
That'll be printed in the specification.
Operating mode. Digital mode, 100%. Worst case in this. Transmit on percentage, 0.5. I use transmitting frequency at 28.5 because I wanted, just for an illustration here. And the spreadsheet came up with 41.52 watts, which made me feel pretty good that my calculations earlier were right. The antenna gain of 1 dBi, distance to the area of interest. In my yard where my vertical antenna is, somebody could walk up to my driveway and I have a rock wall that people are not going to scramble up over. And it's about 25 feet, 20 feet from the base of the vertical antenna. Excuse me. The power density in milliwatts per square centimeter is 0.0112. And Stu even figures out and tells you you're in compliance. So the controlled area is actually 1.108 and the uncontrolled 0.22. So a factor of about 200. Yes?
The power density with reflection. The product of that automatic calculation.
Yes. So this is based on the frequency because we're looking at this band right here. And then it was flat in some areas, so you don't need to worry about it as long as it's between some numbers. Power density with reflection. So, Stu, can you explain what the power density with the reflection is?
So there's a difference between far field exposure from far away from an antenna and near field exposure to an antenna due to reflections in the immediate area, such as reflecting off of the earth and impacting you. So if you're standing across the other side of town, you're not going to get those reflections that are coming from the earth immediately exposing you. They're going to go up in the sky and go away. But if you're close to that antenna, you're going to also get those reflections. So it's a factor to accommodate for the fact that in the near environment to the antenna, you're going to get some additional exposure that you would not otherwise get if you were distant or far away.
And if you look at the difference in the numbers with the reflection, it is a little bit more than twice what the exposure is in that near field without the reflection. Once you do this, take a screenshot of this, print it, and you've got your calculation in hand. Yes?
In a catch-22, in a real-world situation like where I live up in by Palmer Lake, there's no fences. It's all open yard. So I don't have any way to guarantee that nobody wouldn't be standing 1 inch from my antenna potentially. So I would never be able to transmit any power.
I'm going to address that in just a second. Yes, Greg.
Just a generic question.
They want you to run it for each different mode. Why don't you just pick the worst case and run it there and know that if you're OP in the worst case, then you're fine in the other case?
Reading my mind. I was going to tell you that I don't transmit at 100 watts when I'm running digital modes because that fan on that rig comes on pretty quick. It gets hot. So, I mean, you turn it down. I wanted to see worst case if I were running full out. To your point, the FCC recognizes that in an uncontrolled space, and when they illustrate it, they frequently show somebody walking by your yard on the sidewalk. They aren't lingering generally, and it's exposure time. So if somebody walks past your antenna while you're transmitting, they're not in danger, unless they stood there for a good period of time.
You could also go to many websites and buy signs that says you are approaching an RF environment. You know, there's various different colors of these signs. Blue, what is it? I forget. The sun is set since I took this class. But there are various different color levels to warn people that they are approaching.
Hazard.
Yeah, radiation.
So, yes.
Does the distance to area of interest consider the height of the antenna above the ground?
Yes. It does. So if you've got your dipole up on a mast and the closest place, and somebody's standing on the ground, you can measure from the base of that or directly underneath it, and now you've got one side of the triangle and use some trigonometry, and you can figure out what the hypotenuse is, and you get a few more feet when you do that, when you consider that. What do I do if I exceed the MPE, or I'm worried as this gentleman is about somebody who wanders too close? I'll cover that in a second. So I selected 100% duty cycle and an excessive operating time. Make them more realistic to what is the real condition if you find out that you are exceeding the MPE. What's recommended is if you're on the threshold, these are approximations that are made in worst case. So the calculations have actually built some buffer into them. A more accurate way to do that is to use modeling software, and EasyNet is antenna modeling. I think you can figure out parameters, design your own antenna with a tool like this. I've never used it. We can talk about that if it turns out that you need to. What else? I can alter my antenna. The location of my vertical antenna is exposed. For 10 meters, I may need to use a dipole that's elevated that gives me a little bit extra. I'm so far from the actual numbers that I don't really need to worry about this in any of the bands that I'm operating. Cut back on your power. Jim, you may not need to use that room heater. Decrease your talk time, listen more. Again, it's time factors. Put up a fence and warning signs, as Jim just mentioned, and don't operate when people are around. If you've got a party going on in your backyard and you're sick of the people and want to go into the shack and do a little operating, maybe that's not a good idea if they're barbecuing at the base of the antenna.
Be a good idea, and they'll never come back.
I'll withhold comment. So what about my handheld? So this is where it's getting confusing. The ARRL is being very active with the FCC right now to define it. But the good news is that for VHF anyway, older HTs are grandfathered. The newer HTs are going to need modeling to be done by the manufacturers. It may result in higher prices in the future because they do that. Yes?
Is there a cutoff date for what is old and what is new?
I'm speculating at the moment, but if it's on the market right now, it's considered old. If it's in inventory, it's fine. New models that get introduced, the FCC will probably begin to step in and say, they need to do this. It gets a little more challenging when we're now at UHF, though. That 75 centimeter HT antenna is the rule is if it's within 20 centimeters of your body, the FCC requires what's called specific absorption rate testing for above 300 megahertz. What is that? All of your mobile phones have gone through SAR testing. That is a requirement to be able to legally sell a cell phone in this country. And it is totally impractical for hams to do this. Extremely expensive to go through this process. Not going to happen. It remains to be seen if the FCC is going to grant manufacturers exemptions on that. But the equipment that you currently have, you would require it the way that the current rules are written, but it's not practical to do. So we're going to ignore that for the time being, and there's probably going to be additional word from the FCC about that. But your ARRL is working on it. So I put a bunch of resources, different calculators to go help find this. It's relatively easy to figure this out. Plug your numbers in. Hopefully now you have a better idea of what you need to put in there. EasyNet, there's the link to go do that. Might be an interesting topic for a small group meeting sometime in the future, and a bunch of online calculators. But by all means, I highly recommend using Stu's spreadsheet that's available online, because it is it makes it very easy. Yes.
How in the world does FCC expect to be able to enforce any of this?
Right.
So that's a good question, but what I really think is happening is that the FCC is relying on the amateur community to do stuff like this to figure out how to do that. It's confusing when you first look at it, but we've been self-policing our hobby for decades. And off the record, when I'm not being recorded, I may offer a couple of other comments about that, but we're obligated to do this. But they don't have the resources to enforce something like this. What they could do, as I mentioned earlier, is somebody complains, or if there is an issue someplace, or, you got, your house is glowing in the dark for all the power that you're putting out. Somebody may have an issue, and somebody may come to investigate. The odds of this happening are minuscule. But think about now operating 50 watts VHF with a mobile antenna that is on the, just 3 feet from your head on your vehicle, on the pickup cab. And you might want to know, if you're talking cross country and keeping that thing going the entire route, you might want to think twice about where you place that antenna and or how much you operate. So it's for you, your loved ones, and your neighbors' benefit to figure out that you're not causing a problem.
How might this affect portable stations, field-based stations, so to set up parks on the air, things like that?
But you're obligated to run this evaluation. Now, that said, if you've got a good idea, if you've gone through this and understand what my equipment is and what my antenna is, you can do that in advance and just say, look, we don't want to put the tent, a few feet from the rig. So, you can make some pretty broad assumptions if you're well within the limits that, if I bring this in closer, well, it's it's a radius squared rule. So if you've got some margin, you're probably going to be okay. Eric.
I don't recall my question, but it was on slide 31.
So that's my political. Well, time for one.
Should be 41. How do you get?
dB. It's dB. So it's 41.5 factored by 1 dB, which when you calculate it out, 1 dB is equal to 10 log P out divided by P in, or 10 log P out divided by 41.5. 0.1 is 0.1 now because I had to divide by this 10. Log P out minus log 41.5, log P out minus 1.62, so this is 1.72. 10 to the 1.72 is now 52.48. Or you go to that calculator and you put those numbers in and click calculate and it gives you that number. Any other questions?
I'll let you be the judge of that. Hey, Stu, can we let's
The recording, because I got a little bit more to talk about.
Keep him around the ball.